The council chamber was cold. It was always cold. The environmental systems were set for 11 different species, and cold was the only setting that did not kill anyone. Sora stood at the archive terminal and kept her eyes on the sensor readout because looking at the 11 faces around the table was something she could not do right now. The readout showed movement. Inside the pale fence. Moving toward the boundary. Not crashing into it. Not triggering the kill mesh. Moving through it the way smoke moves through fingers. Slow, deliberate, and completely unbothered by the fact that it was not supposed to be possible. Sora. The council chair's voice was tight. What are we looking at? She pulled up the archive. She had kept these files for 230 years. She had organized them, labeled them, added notes in the margins. She had never once expected to open them in a room that looked like this. I'll start from the beginning, she said. The vote had taken 3 days. The archive had the full record. Every argument. Every rebuttal. Every moment someone cleared their throat before saying something they knew was permanent. Sora had read it so many times she could say it from memory, in 6 different languages. Her predecessor, 200 years dead, had laid out the reasoning simply. Humans had fought 3 wars in 40 years, each one larger than the last. Each one built on technology they had developed faster than any species the Council had ever encountered. They were not evil. That was the word her predecessor used, and Sora had always found it strange. Not evil. Just completely unable to slow down. The proposal was a quarantine, not extermination. The Council was careful about that distinction. A boundary. A sphere of space, 18 light-years across, centered on their sun. Suppression beacons along the edge. Fold space disruptors on the travel lanes. An automated kill mesh for anything that tried to leave without clearance. They called it the pale fence. The vote passed 10-0. 1 species abstained. Sora pulled up the abstention file. She had buried it deep, not deleted, but filed under a reference code that took 3 levels of searching to reach. The Drevathai delegate at the time had stood and said, simply, that she did not believe the quarantine would produce the result the Council expected. She did not explain further. The vote moved forward without her. Sora looked up from the terminal. Nari was sitting at the far end of the Council table. Young, for a Drevathai. Sharp eyes. She had voted against renewing the fence at the 200-year review. She had voted against it every single decade for 30 years. She was looking at the sensor readout, not at Sora, and her face was completely still. Sora looked back at the archive. The last transmission from Earth had come 4 hours before the fence activated. The Council had expected a plea. Or a threat. Humans were, in Sora's professional experience, capable of both at very high volume. She had prepared herself for a speech. A negotiation attempt. Something that would need to be carefully recorded and even more carefully ignored. What arrived was a text signal. Sent on every open frequency. In 47 languages. Asterisk will be fine. Asterisk. That was all. The Council had read it as a bluff. Sora had filed it under human psychological responses. Denial. She had been careful. She had been wrong. She had understood this at year 47, when her routine beacon status check returned a result that made her sit very still at her terminal for a long time. The suppression beacons along the southern section of the fence were offline. Not damaged. Offline. Clean shutdown, from the inside. She had run the check 3 times. Then she had written a report, saved it to her personal archive, and not sent it. She had told herself she needed more information. She had told herself this for 183 years, while the status checks kept returning more dark beacons, more clean shutdowns, more evidence of something happening inside the fence that she had no way to explain and no good reason to explain away. She had built an explanation. She had not shared it. The Council chair spoke again. How many ships? Sora pulled up the long-range scan. The fleet coming out from the former fence boundary was not in a combat formation. She had checked this 4 times. The ship designs did not match any human configuration in the archive, which only went up to year 12 of the quarantine, after which all outgoing signals had stopped. These ships were new, built inside the fence, designed by people who had only what the Sol system offered and 200 years to figure out what to do with it. They were strange ships. Not dangerous strange. Just strange in the way something becomes strange when it grows without outside influence. Unfamiliar angles, proportions that worked but looked wrong, The kind of design that comes from solving a problem no one outside the fence had ever needed to solve. There were 47 ships in the lead formation. More behind. Sora. The chair again. How many total? She looked at the count. 412, she said. So far. The room was quiet. Then the open channel signal came through. Audio only. A human voice, male, unhurried, with the particular flatness of a person who had decided a long time ago not to perform urgency for other people's benefit. Galactic Council. This is Admiral Junio, UEF Ungneo. We are coming out now. Try not to make it weird. A pause. Also, your beacon array in Sector 4 is running about 30% below output. You might want to look at that. The channel closed. Sora stood at the terminal. Then she pulled up the full beacon status report, the real one, the one she had never filed, with 230 years of data sitting in it. Every suppression beacon in the pale fence. All 14,000 of them. For lane. Every single one. The structural notes in the margins of her long unread report showed consistent salvage marks on each beacon's frame. Clean cuts. Organized removal. The material had been taken apart carefully, methodically, and used for something else. Humans had not broken through the fence. They had taken it apart, piece by piece, and built with it. Sora closed the report. She did not look at Nari. She did not need to see Nari's face to know what was on it. The emergency session had been running for 6 hours, and the council had not agreed on a single thing. Nari was keeping count. She had a small personal tablet on the table in front of her, and she had been making notes since the session opened. Not of the arguments, she already knew the arguments, but of the number of times each delegate used the word threat compared to the number of times they used the word question. The ratio was 11-1, and it had stayed that way for the full 6 hours. She found this useful information. The council chair wanted a military review. The Velhari bloc wanted a communication blackout. The Orvani delegate, old, careful, with the specific slowness of someone who had survived every political crisis in the last century by outlasting everyone else in the room, wanted to form a subcommittee. He always wanted to form a subcommittee. It was his solution to everything. We should position defense assets at the former boundary, the Velhari bloc leader said. This was the 5th time she had said it. That is a bad idea, Nari said. This was the 5th time she had said it. The Drevathai position has been noted. The Drevathai position has been correct for 30 years, Nari said. I would like that noted also. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something true gets said that everyone had been hoping to leave unsaid. The chair looked at her with the face of someone who had been hoping she would show more patience today. She looked back with the face of someone who had run out of patience at the 200-year renewal vote and had been operating on whatever came after patience since then. Positioning defense assets at the boundary, she said, more carefully, will be understood by humans as a second fence. We do not want to communicate that we are attempting a second fence. We are not. We are not, Nari agreed. But we will look like we are. And humans, based on everything in the archive, respond to the appearance of a cage the same way they respond to an actual one. She paused. I would like everyone in this room to think carefully about what 230 years of that response looks like, before we mime the motion of building one. The room stayed quiet. The defense posture vote failed. The human diplomatic vessel requested docking clearance at way station Orev at the 14th hour. It was a converted engineering ship. Nari had pulled the specifications when the passenger manifest came through. The original frame was a mid-range or hauler, heavily modified. Extra shielding. Expanded life support. A communications array that was frankly better than anything the Council currently mounted on its own diplomatic vessels, which he chose not to mention because the Council was already having a difficult morning. The manifest listed one primary envoy. Una. Senior Envoy, United Earth Federation. Nari had searched the archive for the United Earth Federation. The records went dark at year 12 of the quarantine, but Sora's newly released beacon status reports, which the Council was still processing with visible discomfort, included signal fragments collected up to year 60. In those fragments, the UEF appeared regularly. By year 40, it was governing 9 colony systems. By year 60, the signals stopped entirely. Nari now understood that did not mean the UEF stopped. It meant they stopped broadcasting outward. They turned inward. They focused. She sat with that thought while the Orvani delegate explained why a subcommittee was appropriate. The docking feed from Waystation Orev came through live at the 15th hour. Nari watched it on her personal screen while the session continued around her. The human ship came in clean. No hesitation in the approach. No deviation from the filed path. The pilot docked with the kind of accuracy that suggested they had done this in tighter spaces than Orev's Bay, probably in worse conditions, probably without a working beacon to guide them, probably while also doing several other things at the same time. The ramp came down. Una walked off it in a suit that had clearly been made, not bought from a catalogue. The fabric was good. The cut was thoughtful. But everything about it had the look of something built from available materials by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had long since stopped being precious about resources. She was not dressed like a diplomat performing importance. She was dressed like a person with a job. The Waystation master approached with a formal greeting prepared. Nari could see it in his posture, the slight stiffness of rehearsal. Una spoke first. Your beacon array in Sector 7 is running about 14% below calibration output, she said. We noticed it on the approach. We have a full technical team aboard. Happy to have someone take a look if you want. The Waystation master said nothing for a moment. Una waited, with the patience of someone who was used to waiting. The formal session had produced 3 things by the end of the day. First, the Council would not be positioning defense assets at the old boundary. Second, official communication channels with the UEF fleet were to be opened immediately. Third, the Orvani subcommittee proposal was tabled, not passed, tabled, which in council language meant no one had the energy to kill it outright and no one was willing to call it useful. Nari wrote all 3 outcomes in her notes. Then she wrote, underneath them, asterisk they came out offering to fix things. Asterisk. She looked at those words for a while. It was either the most human behavior she had ever seen or the most carefully calculated opening move she had encountered in 30 years of council work. It was probably both. With humans, it was generally both. She stayed late to watch the corridor feeds from Waystation Orev. Una moved through the station with a specific quality of attention. Not suspicious, not aggressive, just thorough. She looked at every junction, every access panel, every system indicator. Not obviously. The way you look at things when looking at things is simply something you do, as naturally as breathing, because you grew up in a place where knowing how things worked was not optional. Her 3 staff members were doing the same thing. None of them were taking notes. None of them needed to. Nari thought about the suppression beacons. 14,000 of them, dismantled one by one over 2 centuries. Not destroyed, recycled. Iron into infrastructure. Circuitry into navigation. Frame materials into fold lane construction. Every component accounted for. Nothing wasted. On the feed, Una paused at a section of corridor paneling. A panel cover, slightly misaligned. She crouched and looked at the screws. Stood. Moved on. She did not have tools. She was not going to fix it today. She was just noting it. The way you note a thing that should be fixed when you have a moment. Nari closed the feed. She thought, the council prepared for survivors. People who needed things. People who could be managed through what they needed. She thought about the ship that had docked today. Converted or hauler, 200-year-old frame, entirely rebuilt, running a communications array better than anything in the council's current fleet. She thought about 412 ships that no one had on record because they had been built inside a closed system by people with nothing to work with but time and necessity. She thought about Una looking at the screws on a misaligned panel. That was not what walked through the door. Nari went back to the session room to file her end-of-day notes. She did not say anything to the remaining delegates about what she had seen on the feed. She wrote her notes. She made her record. She time-stamped everything. She had been doing that for 30 years. It was almost satisfying to finally have something worth time-stamping. The fold drive calibration was off by 3%. Taiho caught it at 0400, which was when he always caught things, not because 0400 was a good hour for catching things but because 0400 was when his mind was sharpest, which said something about him that he preferred not to examine too closely. He pulled the data, found the drift point, and fixed it in about 4 minutes. Then he sat with the readout and thought about whether there was a secondary cause, because 3% drifts do not happen on their own. There was a secondary cause. There was always a secondary cause. He fixed that too. The Galactic Council had sent a navigation data package 2 days ago. Charts of the space outside the former fence boundary. Lane markers. Hazard notes. Standard data for a vessel entering unknown territory. It was a diplomatic gesture, offered with good intent, and Taiho had opened it, gone through the first 40 pages, and saved it into a folder he had labeled without much thought. *quaint. The Council's charts were 230 years out of date in several sections. Some parts had been updated. Version numbers were in the file headers, but the update process had clearly not been consistent, and the lane stability data for sectors next to the old fence boundary was, in Taiho's professional view, the kind of data that could kill people who trusted it. He did not trust it. He built over it using the UEF's own survey maps, which were better, not because the UEF had more resources, but because the UEF's maps had been built by people who had no margin for error. Bad maps were a problem you fixed before you moved, not after. He did not think of this as arrogance. It was just the difference between a map made by someone with options and a map made by someone without. He had been born on the third colony, which people called Nuri because the original designation was a number, and numbers made bad names for places where children grew up. Nuri was an asteroid belt colony. Small. Efficient. Maintained the way everything was maintained inside the fence, not because anyone told you to, but because letting things slide had consequences, and consequences on Nuri were not abstract. Cold was a consequence. Hunger was a consequence. Dark was a consequence. You learned, young, that the systems around you required attention and that the attention had to come from you because there was nowhere else to get it. Taiho had learned to fix things before he learned to read. He had grown up knowing the space outside the fence the way you know a country you have only read about, through other people's words, through projected models, through navigational sims he had run 10,000 times in training. He had been prepared for it. He knew what it was supposed to look like. He understood the math of it. He was not prepared for it. The first time he went to the observation port, 2 days out from the old boundary, after the first fold lane transit in open space, the difference hit him in the body before it reached his mind. It was not the size. He had known the size. It was something else. A weight. A quality the model versions had never captured, because the model versions were made by people who already knew what it was like and could not see what they were leaving out. The space inside the fence was theirs. Mapped, named, worked, lived in. It had history in every sector. Every rock had been assessed. Every lane had been traveled. It was space that knew people were in it. The space outside did not know they existed. Taiho had stayed at the window for 3 hours without moving. Junio had found him there. The Admiral came in, looked at the window, looked at Taiho, and then sat down on the floor next to him, back against the wall below the port, legs stretched out, and looked at the stars without saying anything. He did not ask what Taiho was thinking. Taiho did not explain. They stayed there together in the dark until Taiho's hands got restless and he had to go find something to fix. The ship was called the Young Neo. The name was old, older than the quarantine, older than the current Federation. It had been painted on the original hull of a cargo vessel that was sitting in dock when the fence closed and had never been able to leave. Over 230 years the ship had been rebuilt from the keel out, almost completely, so many times that not a single original part remained except the nameplate on the forward section, which was bolted over a frame that had been replaced twice. Engineers had kept the nameplate. Not out of sentiment, exactly. More out of the feeling that some things deserve to continue. Taiho loved the ship the way you love something you have fixed 1,000 times. Not affection, exactly. Something more like familiarity taken to its deepest level. He knew every sound the young Neo made. He knew which vibrations were normal and which ones needed attention. He knew the fold drive's complaint in cold conditions, the life support system's tendency to overcorrect on low-gravity transit, the secondary coolant line's habit of developing small loose couplings at predictable intervals. He knew all of it the way you know a language you grew up speaking, not because you studied it but because you lived inside it for so long that it became part of how you thought. He found the loose coupling in the secondary coolant line at the end of his shift. Small. Not dangerous yet. He fixed it in 10 minutes, wrote it in the log, moved on. He went back to the observation port when he was done. He told himself it was practical, keeping his mental model of the external environment current, making sure his understanding of the operational space matched reality. He was lying to himself and was aware of this and did not particularly mind. He stood at the window. It was bigger than expected. Not in terms of size. He had always known the size, had known it for years. But there was something the numbers never conveyed. A weight. An indifference. The galaxy outside the port was enormous and old and completely unaware that 412 ships had just come through a boundary that used to be solid and were now sitting in its lanes. He thought about his mother telling him, when he was small, that the stars outside the fence were the same stars that had always been there. That space was space. That distance was just a number. She was right about the stars. She was not entirely right about the rest. He stayed at the window longer than he planned. When he finally went back to his station, he pulled up the Council's navigation charts again, the ones from the *quaint* folder, and started going through them section by section. Not to show anyone. Not to make a point. Just because leaving bad data in an active navigation system felt wrong in the same direct way that leaving a loose coupling felt wrong. It was a fixable problem and he was present, and those two facts together were sufficient reason to fix it. He annotated as he went. Added the UEF survey data. Flagged the outdated sections. Noted where the lane stability readings needed to be updated. His handwriting in the margin notes was the handwriting of someone who had written in margins their whole life. Dense, practical, no extra words. He did not think about what it meant to rewrite someone else's map. He just worked through his shift, fixing what needed fixing, the way he always had, while outside the window the galaxy stayed enormous and indifferent and slowly, without knowing it, started to become known. The Council's proposal was 112 pages long. Una had read all of it on the shuttle ride from the diplomatic ship to the Council's meeting chamber. She read quickly, not skimming, actually reading, the way you read something you intend to respond to, and by page 30 she understood the shape of it. By page 60 she had a response built in her head. By page 112 she had finished her tea, set down the cup, and looked out the shuttle window at the docking arm of the station and thought, that's one option. The proposal was called the Graduated Reintegration Framework. It had a formal title and numbered sections and 3 appendices. Someone had worked hard on it. She could see the work in it and she did not disrespect the work. It was careful. It was thorough. It was, structurally, a second quarantine with cleaner language. Tiered status levels. Supervised territorial access. A 50-year observation period. A joint committee to review UEF expansion requests on a decade cycle. Limits on fleet movement. Limits on fold lane construction. A long, carefully worded section on integration benchmarks. Measurements the Council would use to decide when human restrictions could be lifted, at the Council's discretion, on the Council's timeline. It was the kind of document written by people who expected to be negotiating with someone who needed something. She walked into the meeting chamber, sat down, and smiled at the 11 faces across the table. "We appreciate the detail of the proposal," she said. She meant it. It was detailed. "The UEF has prepared a counterproposal," she said, and nodded to her staff. They had printed it. Physical copies, actual paper, which humans had continued making inside the fence because you needed materials that worked without a power grid, and the habit had lasted. 4,000 pages, bound in sections, 1 copy per delegate. Her staff placed them on the table with the care of people who had carried them a long way. The room looked at the stacks. "We have mapped the UEF's current capabilities against the Council's known infrastructure deficits," Una said, "based on publicly available Council records and our own survey data from the past 2 centuries. We thought it was polite to show our work." Sora picked up the first section and opened it. She was quiet for a long time. Una watched her read. The first 10 pages covered fold lane stabilization technology that the UEF had developed at year 60 of the quarantine. It had been developed because the colonies needed stable fold lanes to survive, and when survival is the alternative to solving a problem, you solve the problem quickly and you do not leave gaps in your solution. The Council, based on their public budget filings, had been working on fold lane stabilization in the outer sectors for 62 years. It was listed as an active priority. Sora turned to page 11. Her face did something that had no clean translation across species. The formal sessions ran for 2 full days. The Council argued. That was their right and their function, and Una did not rush it. She answered direct questions directly. She did not volunteer information beyond what was asked. She was not hiding anything. She was applying the principle that in a negotiation, the person who talks least tends to learn the most, and she was very interested in learning what the Council was actually afraid of beneath the procedure and the formal language. It was not, she concluded by the end of day 1, human aggression. It was human * capability star. Aggression they had frameworks for. Aggression they had managed across dozens of species conflicts in the Council's long history. Aggression was a problem with known solutions: containment, deterrence, treaty structures, monitored disarmament. What had walked through the door 2 days ago did not fit a known solution. What had walked through was 412 ships built from recycled suppression beacons, carrying people who had developed fold lane technology, sustainable closed-loop colony systems, and navigation charts better than the Council's own, in isolation, with no outside help, in 230 years of being told they were contained. You could not manage that through a committee. On the second day, the old Orvana delegate asked the question she had been waiting for. He asked it carefully. He asked whether the circumstances of the quarantine had produced any change in what the Council's original assessment had identified as humanity's core risk factor, its aggression. The room went quiet. Una looked at him. "We had nobody to be aggressive toward," she said. She let it sit. The quarantine removed the primary driver of human conflict, which historically was competition for resources with external groups, she continued. We were closed in with our own resources. We had to manage them carefully. We had to resolve internal disputes without the option of expanding outward as a release valve. We found other things to focus on. The delegate nodded slowly. She did not say, "We have not forgotten how." She did not say, 412 ships came through that boundary and we have not pointed a weapon at anyone. She did not say any of the things that were true and would also have sounded like a threat. There was no need. The room already understood the weight of what was sitting across the table from them. She did not need to describe it. She let them hold it. On the second afternoon, Junio walked into the session. He was not listed as an attendee. He had not submitted an observer request. He came in through the side entrance in his working uniform, the admiral of the UEF fleet, in a ship jacket with a small grease mark on the left sleeve that he had clearly not noticed, and sat down in one of the back observer seats and folded his arms and looked at the center of the room. He did not say anything. He just sat there. The vote to table the full discussion for a military preparedness review, which had been tracking toward a clear majority for 40 minutes, failed 4-7. Nobody explained why the math had changed. Junio left before the session formally closed. Nari asked the real question on the third morning. Not in the session room. In the corridor outside it, before the doors opened, when it was just the two of them standing in the quiet with nowhere else to be for a moment. Nari turned and looked at her and asked, not as a delegate, not with any formal framing, what Una wanted. Not the UEF. Not the delegation. You. What do you want? Una was quiet. It was the first time in 3 days she had needed a moment before answering. Same thing we always did, she said. Room. Nari nodded. The doors opened and they went in. She went back to her quarters after the third session and sat on the edge of the bunk and pressed one hand flat against the wall. It was warm. The Ungneo always ran warm, Taiho's long-standing argument with the cooling system, which he had never fully resolved and which she suspected he did not entirely want to resolve because the warmth was familiar. She had grown up in an underground colony where the walls were warm from geothermal draw. Cheap. Reliable. The warmth that meant the systems were working and everything was fine. She held her hand there. Did not think about anything specific. Did not think about the last time a wall was warm when she had not expected it to be. The way her hands had gone completely still. The way she had needed to stand in a doorframe for a while before she could move again. She moved now. She picked up the counter-proposal file and started preparing the final draft for signature. The graduated reintegration framework was not in it. She had removed it on day one. Nobody had noticed until the final draft review, at which point she had said, very mildly, that it must have been lost in the revision, and smiled, and the moment had passed without any further discussion. She worked until the lights shifted to night cycle. Outside the station, 412 ships sat in the dark, running warm, holding steady, waiting with the patience of people who had learned a long time ago that patience was just another thing you built. The signing took 11 minutes. Junio stood at the back of the chamber and watched the council delegates put their marks on the document and thought, 11 minutes is a short amount of time for 230 years. He did not say this out loud. He was not a man who said things like that out loud. Out loud was where thoughts like that went to become small and manageable, and he did not want this one to be small. The accord was not everything the UEF had asked for. It was not nothing, either. Full territorial rights to the former quarantine zone, which was, after 2 centuries of non-stop development, the most densely built region of known space, a fact the Council was still absorbing. Observer status on the Council immediately. Voting rights on a 10-year review cycle. No cap on fleet size. No limits on fold lane construction. The graduated reintegration framework was entirely absent from the final document, and when he had asked Una about this, she had looked at him with an expression of complete and unreadable calmness and said it must not have made the final cut. He had not pushed it. He watched the last delegate sign. He watched the council chair seal the document with the formal acknowledgement tone. He thought about his grandmother, and then he stopped thinking about his grandmother because this was not the place for it and he had work to do. Sora found him in the corridor outside the chamber. After. She had the look of a person who had rehearsed something. He could see the shape of it in her face, the specific tension of prepared words waiting behind the eyes. She got 2 sentences in. The beginning of something that was built like an apology. He put up a hand. Not hard. Just a hand. Don't, he said. I wasn't there. My grandmother was. A pause. She was 14 when the fence closed. She died at 94 inside it. She never once saw open space. Sora was very still. You want to say something to someone, he said. You can figure out how to say it to her. He walked away. He was not angry at Sora. He was clear on that in his own head, not angry at her specifically, not angry at any individual in that chamber, because anger required energy and he had learned a long time ago to spend his energy on things that could still be changed. Sora's apology could not change anything. His grandmother's 94 years inside the fence could not be changed. The sound the beacons made when they activated, that low hum you felt in the back of your teeth that she had described to him once, only once, in a flat voice that told him the describing cost her something, could not be changed. The corridor was long. He walked the whole length of it in silence. Taiho filed his post-mission engineering report at 1600. It was 43 pages. Other engineers on the fleet filed 8 to 12. Taiho filed 43 because 43 was what you got when you actually checked everything. And checking everything was not optional, it was just the job. The report covered every system on the Agneo, every calibration run, every repair, every small anomaly noted and resolved. A complete record. The kind of record that would let someone rebuild the ship from paperwork alone if they had to. At the end, there was an optional field. Personal notes. Most engineers left it blank. Taiho sat for a moment with his hands over the input. He had been sitting with the same thought for 3 days and had not found a better way to say it. He typed, asterisk bigger out here than I expected. Asterisk. He submitted the report. He went to find a loose panel in the secondary corridor that had been bothering him since day 2. Not dangerous, just misaligned, just a thing that should be right and wasn't. He fixed it in 6 minutes. Noted it in his personal log. Moved on. Then he went to the observation port, because he had started ending his shifts there. Just to look. He told himself it was good operational practice, keeping his mental model of the external space current. He was lying to himself and knew it and had decided to let it go. He stood at the window. He thought about Nuri. The colony walls, close and warm, always carrying that low background hum from a life support. The way everything inside the fence had a human mark on it. Names, histories, repairs, the accumulated presence of people who had been there. He thought about his mother telling him the stars outside were the same stars that had always been there. She was right about the stars. Outside the window, those same stars sat in space that weighed something the models had never gotten right. He stayed until the lights shifted to night cycle, and then he went back to his station and kept working. Nari and Una ended up in a corridor by accident. 2 people walking in opposite directions, both thinking about other things, stopping when they nearly walked into each other. They stood there. Nari said, I voted against the renewal. 6 times. Over 30 years. Una said, I know. We tracked every council vote. A pause. We tracked everything, Una added. Nari absorbed this. She had known, in an abstract way, that it was likely. 230 years of careful, inward-focused people with very good engineering and absolutely nothing to spend it on except paying close attention to the world outside the boundary they could not cross. Of course they had tracked the votes. Of course they had read everything. Thank you, Una said. Not warmly. Not coldly. The way you say something that is simply true and deserves to be said out loud exactly once. Nari nodded. They went their separate ways. Walking back, Nari thought about the original abstention. 230 years ago, a Drevathai delegate standing up and saying she did not believe the quarantine would produce the expected result. Not elaborating. Sitting back down. Letting the vote proceed without her agreement, because she did not have the votes to stop it and she knew it. She thought, some things take a very long time to finish being right. She turned the corner and went back to work. Junio stood at the observation window of the way station at 1940. He had stood here once before, early in the morning before the signing, in the dark when the station was quiet. He had looked at the place where the pale fence used to be. There was nothing there now, not even scar tissue in the space lanes, not even a marker. Taiho's people had cleared it completely. The material was already in use somewhere in the colony infrastructure. The iron did not go to waste. Nothing went to waste. His grandmother had described the closing to him once. She had been 14. Standing in the observation bay of a school on the second colony, on a class trip that had been planned weeks earlier and had not been cancelled in time, watching the beacons activate along the boundary arc. The sound, she said, was a low hum that you felt in your back teeth, not heard with your ears. It lasted 3 days. After a while you stop noticing it because the brain absorbs constant things into the baseline of the world, files them as normal, stops marking them. The baseline of her world for 80 years was a cage she could not hear anymore. He had not asked her how that felt. He had not needed to. His comms came through at 1940. The second UEF convoy had received clearance from the Council Transit Authority to cross the old boundary line. 700 ships. Colonists. Engineers. Medical teams. Teachers. Families who had been on the departure registry for years, some of them for a decade, waiting for a door that had not existed yet. People who had grown up hearing about the galaxy outside the fence the way you hear about a place that belongs to someone else, that you are not allowed to go to, that exists on the other side of a rule you did not write and cannot change. Until now. Clear to proceed, he said. He watched the convoy on the long-range screen. Ship by ship. Running lights in the dark. The formation was organized. Of course it was organized. Every UEF operation was organized. Moving with the quiet steadiness of people who had been ready for a long time and were not going to make a performance of it now that it was finally happening. He watched them go through. One by one. The running lights crossing the line where the fence used to be, where the beacons used to hum, where the killmesh used to wait. He watched until the last light cleared the boundary and disappeared into open space. The galaxy did not react. It was large and old and indifferent, the way it always was, the way it would be long after all of them were gone. It did not know what had just come through. It would learn. Junio turned from the window. He had a fleet debrief in 20 minutes. A maintenance scheduling review after that. A backlog of Federation administration that had piled up during 3 days of diplomatic work. A report to file on the Accord. A message to send back to the colonies, where people were waiting to hear. He went to file the report first. He did not say anything poetic about what he had just watched. He did not think anything poetic about it. He was not that kind of man and he had long since made his peace with that. He just walked back down the corridor, hands in his pockets, going back to work. Behind him, through the observation window, the stars held steady. The door did not close again.